Hello and welcome to our webinar series, Art and Architecture with Curt DiCamillo. My name is Ginevra Morse. I manage all events and programs here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical organization in the country, specializing in providing resources, research, and expertise to uncover the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Now, whether you are a fan or not of the Netflix original series The Crown, you are certainly in for a treat today as Curt DiCamillo takes you on a virtual tour of just some of the English country houses that stand in for the palaces, castles, and other royal estates portrayed in the series. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel at any point during the presentation. You should find that on the right of your screen. We do ask that, of course, you remain muted. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can at the end. And I do want to note that we are broadcasting from our homes to yours with various limitations and distractions. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. And if we were to lose connection for any reason, not to worry, you will still have access to a full recording of this presentation on our website, as well as our YouTube channel. So, as noted, our tour guide today is Curt DiCamillo, an internationally recognized authority on English country houses and the decorative arts. Curt joined American Ancestors in February of 2016 as our first curator of special collections. As curator of special collections, Curt provides strategic direction and expert guidance for organizing and exhibiting our extensive collection of family history-related artifacts. He has also led highly successful heritage tours for our organization to England, Scotland, and Italy, and has lectured extensively in the United States and abroad. And Curt was previously executive director of the National Trust for Scotland Foundation, USA. All right, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Curt DiCamillo.
Good afternoon, everybody. I have the perfect antidote to these dangerous treasonous times in which we're living. I'm going to whisk us all away to sublime England, a place that I call the Promised Land. Before we get started, I want to say that this has been an amazing lecture for me, not just because it's an incredible subject matter, but also because we set a record for the Art and Architecture series. Over 2,300 of you signed up for today's lecture. Thank you guys so much. And a special thank you to the folks who are joining us today from the Royal Oak Foundation. I also want to thank my friend Lindsay Fulton, who suggested this idea. She's obsessed with the Crown and said, you should do a lecture about this. And in that same thank you department, I want to say thank you to my partner in crime, Ginevra Morse, whose voice you just heard. Because after I sat down and started researching this, I said to Ginevra, we have 40 different locations that I have identified. You know, if I did a lecture, it would take like 4 hours to do 40 locations. What should I do? How should I focus? And Ginevra came up with the idea, which was we're gonna put into action, which is focusing on just the royal residences. And that also gives us the opportunity to focus later on down the line and possibly doing another Crown filming location lecture. And just to give you an example, for instance, Buckingham Palace is portrayed by 8 different locations. And that's also a perfect example of how movie companies use the filming. So you oftentimes will have a character in a room, let's say in Buckingham Palace, and he walks from that room to the next room. No big deal, seamless. But in fact, he's walking from one room in one house to a room in another house that's 40 miles away. And this is obviously the art of the filmmaking, where the location scout says, I like this room for that one, and that room for this one. And to make that happen, I'm going to put these things together. The other thing, of course, is that filmmakers, and even something with a big budget like this, want to try to reduce location costs as much as possible. And one of the reasons why this is such an expensive production is because 75% of it is filmed on location, which means it's incredibly expensive. And that is compared to filming on a soundstage, for instance, which is how most movies and TV shows are done. So for instance, rather than going to countries around the world, the movie makers in this case went to Spain when they were supposedly in Mystique, when they were in California, and when they were in Australia. They never came to the United States. When Princess Diana goes to New York City, that was Manchester in England. And this goes on and on and on, and none of it was ever filmed in the United States, for instance, even though we have a number of scenes that supposedly take place here. The other thing I want to say before we get started is that there is sometimes a delay. I've noticed this myself when I'm talking and I can see the next slide and you guys can't. So what I want to say to you is that don't worry, it's in the works, and sometimes there's just a communication problem getting the slide to broadcast out to everybody. Okay, so let's jump in. What you're looking at here, of course, is part of the opening credits of The Crown. And I find this really interesting because I suspect that the movie makers intend a purpose, a symbolic purpose of showing you this crown, because this is actually a crown without its gems in it. And when we go to the next slide, you can see what this would look like, because what you see there is the Imperial State Crown, a copy of it without its stones. And this is what it looks like with its stones in it. And this is important because, as I say, I think there's all kinds of symbolism you could use here, but the important thing is that the crowns you see today was primarily created for Queen Victoria in 1838. And before Queen Victoria came to the throne, with a few exceptions, like the Black Prince Ruby that you see there in the middle, the stones for a coronation were rented for the day because it was too expensive to have all these jewels. And literally the next day, all the pieces were taken out and they were sent back to the jewelers. And you had a crown that looked like this. This is Queen Victoria's regal circlet. This is how all the crowns would have looked in between coronations. And it was Queen Victoria and Prince Albert who sat down and figured out the cost, because the cost of renting the stones for one day was enormous. And they figured out over the course of 2 coronations, you could buy the stones rather than renting them. And that's what happened. So that's why we actually have these beautiful stones you see in the Tower of London today. And of course, it was under Queen Victoria that the Tower of London first opened as a tourist attraction to see the crown jewels, because of course there was something sparkly to see there. Now, I think everybody has fallen in love, as I have, with Claire Foy, who of course played the Queen in the first 2 seasons, and you see her here with Matt Smith. One of the things that came out last November, which is incredibly irritating, is that she was paid less than Matt Smith for the TV series, and we can file that in the Department of Some Things Never Change. So I mentioned to you before, we'd focus on just the royal residences to try to get a handle and keep this unwieldy behemoth down to an hour. So I'm going to go through and show you Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Kensington Palace, and Balmoral Castle. And how that's going to work is I'm going to show you all the various locations that were used to portray that in the TV series. And of course, we start with Buckingham Palace because it's the most famous. Now, ironically, this is also the newest residence. Queen Victoria is the very first monarch to live here. By British standards, this is actually quite new indeed. It was built mainly by her uncle, King George IV. And as you see today, it was only created to look like this in the early 20th century, 1913. So it's interesting, you talk to Brits and they'll say to you, well, that's the new palace. And even if you go back and look today, the American ambassador to Britain is posted to the court of St. James's. And that's because the seat of the monarchy officially is St. James's Palace, which is a Tudor palace, which is still visible and is still there in London, but is not open to the public, unlike Buckingham Palace. So Buckingham Palace is incredibly grand, but some of the interiors that they use in the filming are actually grander than the real palace. And one of those is the old Royal Naval College in London, which you see here. You can see that UNESCO called it the finest and most dramatically cited architectural and landscape ensemble in the British Isles. Now, what they're talking about is the college, which are those 2 buildings on either side, and the Queen's House, which is in the middle, which is where I have that red arrow. The Queen's House was there first. That was built about 1616. And in the late 17th century, in the 1690s, when these series of buildings were going to be constructed, Christopher Wren was the primary designer, and he was told, you cannot block the view that the Queen has to the river. So that's why you have this amazing setup. The interiors are astonishing. The chapel, for instance, is a tour de force of late 17th, early 18th century British design. This kind of design, to me, would only be found in Britain. And you see incredible painting. The paintings continue when you go into the next building. So you go next door to the painted hall, and you can see the ceiling here. This is done by an American, I almost said American, by an English artist, Sir James Thornhill. And there's nothing in Buckingham Palace that is quite as grand as this. And the grandness continues. If you go in and look under one of the domes, in this case, the dome of the painted hall, which is the building attached to this, and you look up, you can see this astonishing view. Once again, paintings by James Thornhill. And in the very middle there is the Garter Star, which is, of course, the highest order of chivalry in Britain. And in the very middle of that is the Red Cross on a white field of St. George, who, of course, is the patron saint of England. So what I'm going to do with each of these houses is give you guys some context about other movies that were filmed here. And these are just some of them. It's interesting to me that I wish I'd ever seen Lara Croft Tomb Raider. I'd love to know what was used in that movie for here, but you can see there's a wide variety of movies that have been filmed here over the years. And I cannot emphasize again that this is a small snapshot. I had to winnow down these lists to be able to fit them onto the screen. And this is a good place probably to say that most of these houses, this is not a house, this is actually owned by a nonprofit foundation today, the Greenwich Foundation, and is open to the public. They make more money from filming than anything else they do. Number 2 in that line would be having weddings there, and number 3 would be people like us coming to visit. And while we're in London, we'll go to suburban London to Osterley Park. This is the great house that was built in the 16th century for Sir Thomas Gresham, who was a very rich merchant in the city of London. So this was built during the reign of Elizabeth I. And then after he died, passed to a number of different owners. And in the 18th century, it was owned by the Child family, who were very rich bankers. And they hired Robert Adam to come in and to update the house. So he did all the interiors on the first floor over, and then he put this wonderful portico onto this house that created a semi-enclosed courtyard. And it's really interesting because the house itself is still very Tudor, and you go in the inside and you see the entrance hall here. This was meant to mimic a Roman mausoleum, and of course it has that somber feeling to it. If you remember back to the episode in The Crown when Prince Philip's mother came to live with them, Princess Alice, the only episode that made me cry. She was such an amazing person, and she really was, just as she was portrayed in real life. When he would go to see her, when Prince Philip would go upstairs to see her, he would go up these stairs to her rooms at Buckingham Palace. And this is considered one of Robert Adams' tour de forces. Those lamps that he designed, those oil lamps, very, very unique and just incredibly sumptuous. And you see on the photograph on the right, those plaster urns in the walls. Perfect classic example of Robert Adam at his absolute best. And a lovely little follow-up for that is this door surround in the drawing room. Those colors, those pastel colors, that pink and green, those are Adam colors. And we think oftentimes of the 18th century, really any time in the past, as being very dull color-wise. Adam loved bright colors. And of course, what you're seeing here as well is a reinterpretation of the discovery of ancient ruins. So this is, when this house was done in the 1760s, these interiors were put up. New excavations were happening all the time in Europe, particularly in Pompeii and Herculaneum. So what you see here is Adam interpreting these things that are being discovered under the ground. And the most famous room for scholars at Osterley is the Etruscan room, which is the first of its kind in Europe. This was a mistake. The 18th century historians believed that this orange and black design was from an Etruscan thing. It was actually Greek, but it's that word Etruscan sort of stuck. And what you see here is these hand-painted designs on the ceiling, particularly on the walls, and even the furniture was designed with this. It's just an amazing tour de force. And if you are, like I, a lover of neoclassicism, this is a place to come and worship. So every big house had a state apartment, which was a place that was done for the king or the queen if they came to visit. And you, of course, had a state bedroom as part of that. And obviously, you had a state bed inside there. And this is the bed that Adam designed. Now, of course, this was never slept in by royalty because the child family who commissioned this were bankers. And that, of course, meant they were in trade. And, of course, royalty would never come and stay in someone's house who made money in trade. But the bed is an amazing tour de force of design. You can see on the right here this engraving of a temple that doesn't exist anymore, the Temple of the Sun in Baalbek, which is today in Lebanon. And that's what this bed was modeled on. It's an unusual 8-poster bed. And you can see each corner has 2 instead of 1 post. And if we go into this next slide here and you look down at the slide on the bottom right, you can see those 2 posts coming together, which is amazing in and of itself, but look at the inlay of the wood and the design and the color. This was an unbelievably expensive bed. A little over the top even for my neoclassical taste, because if you look on the photograph on the left and you look up to that dome, those are artificial silk flowers, which is what Robert Adams specified for this bed, which I think is just a little too tchotchke for me. But it's an amazing bed. And also, while you're looking at that bed, don't forget to look up at the wonderful plasterwork on the ceiling. Osterley is used a lot for filming as well, and I think you need to keep in mind that the closer a house is to London, the more likely it is to be used for filming, because as I mentioned to you earlier, most productions have a few exterior shots and then they use a soundstage at a London studio. So obviously if you have a house that's close to London, you want to do for your exteriors, less time, less money. Now, of the ones I have listed here, I think my favorite is a movie that's pretty much forgotten today, The Grass is Greener, with Deborah Kerr and Cary Grant from 1960, where unusually for the time period, when almost always studios were used, they used a lot of interior shots as well as exteriors of the house. So now we're going to go to Wiltshire. And once again, just a reminder, we're still using the interiors of Buckingham Palace. This is Wilton House, which, since it was built in its current form in the 17th century, has been owned by the Earls of Pembroke, and it's still owned by them today. The second Earl of Pembroke was the patron of William Shakespeare, and we know that Shakespeare himself and his company of players performed the very first performances of Twelfth Night and As You Like It on this very lawn in front of the house, which is pretty damn cool all by itself. Now, if you think back to the Queen in the TV series, sitting at her desk at Buckingham Palace, she's looking out oftentimes into this landscape. And this is the Palladian Bridge, designed by the 9th Earl of Pembroke, who's called the Architect Earl. This is was unique when it was built. It's based on a design by Palladio that was never executed by him. And this was done in the 18th century. First one of its kind in the world. There were 3 others that were copied in England and 1 in St. Petersburg, Russia. And this is something in my world of architectural history that people come literally from all over the world to see. When we go inside, the Queen's office was this room, the large smoking room. So if you take away that table, clear out that little stool in front of the fireplace there, and you put the Queen's desk right in front of the fireplace, that was, and is, I think they're still using it, the office in every one of her scenes in the palace. And the key to identifying this room when you're watching the TV series are those wonderful, yes, thank you very much, Ginevra, those wonderful paintings you see Ginevra moving her cursor around. Now, a lovely story about houses being born and reborn comes up with the private dining room. So the current Earl of Pembroke, who is a very hot young man with a gorgeous young wife, he came across the bottom photograph. This was called the junk room, and it looked like this for most of the 20th century. And when his father died and the current Earl inherited, he said, we need to check this room and make something of it. Now, look at that on the bottom, and then look at the finest on the top. That shows you this incredible recreation. Going back and forth, look at the door on the bottom one. It's a fancy door, but it doesn't have those caryatids that you see surrounding it. It doesn't have those chandeliers. And this was used as the dining room in Buckingham Palace in this current form that you see today. Didn't have those paintings on the walls, obviously. Didn't have the plasterwork on the walls. If you look, it's just amazing what a dedicated person can do. And of course, this is not a poor person. He's not Bill Gates rich. He does have one of the most important collections of art in Europe, but still, I think this is an amazing reproduction. The reason most people come here house-wise is to see the double cube room. This is considered the finest surviving mid-17th century room in England. And it's called a double cube room because it is the equivalent of 2 cubes put side by side. So it's 60 feet long, 30 feet tall, and 30 feet wide. And to the right of this photograph that you can't see is the single cube room, which is 30 by 30 by 30. Between them, those 2 rooms have 16 Van Dycks. That's all you see hanging in the walls here are Van Dycks, including the largest Van Dyck ever painted at the far end there. That's the 4th Earl of Pembroke and his family, 17 feet long. All the furniture in here is designed by Chippendale. It is a tour de force of English interiors, and you can see why this room in particular would be used for the interiors of Buckingham Palace. And I have to bring in Bridgerton, which I now have been obsessed with. So this is actually a scene from Bridgerton with the Queen sitting in her throne room at Buckingham Palace. And of course, what she's sitting in, as you can guess, is the double cube room from Wilton. There is that wonderful Van Dyck behind her there. If you look at this room, you will see over and over and over again throughout TV shows and movies, any kind of grand palace scene. It's almost always used here. There's another reason that this room is so important to history, however, and that is because Wilton, like every house, was taken over by the government during World War II and used for military purposes. And in this case, it became the headquarters for the Southern Command, and all of the D-Day landings were planned in that room. And the King was here, the Queen, Churchill, Eisenhower, all this was planned here. 2.7 million men. Their logistics were all planned through this one room. Pretty mind-blowing if you think about it, the history that's been given to us. And to bring us up to date on the Queen and the Queen of the King, I shouldn't call JFK the King, I'm sure he thought he was. So this is actually JFK and Jackie meeting the Queen and Prince Philip, and if you look around, you can see they are standing in the double cube room at Wilton. And the way you can tell that, you look on the wall behind them, that carving, which is normally in most houses plaster, and the reason for that is it's cheap because you can take it in a mold, glue it onto the wall. That's carved wood, very expensive, and it shows you just how rich the Pembroke family was. And to take the same room, once again from the same series, different season, here is Princess Diana when she's by herself, left in the palace at Buckingham Palace, doing her ballet in the double cube room. It's impossible to leave this house and not talk about what most curators consider to be one of the most important pieces of English art ever created, which is called the Wilton diptych. And that's because it originally was in the collection at Wilton House, where it was for a large part of its history. It's now in the National Gallery in London. So this is 14th century, which is pretty amazing. It shows the king, the then king, Richard II, kneeling there on the left, and he's looking up to heaven on the right there. Of course, what I love about this is heaven is clearly England, because you see the angels have the flag of St. George, the patron saint of England. And we believe this was probably made for the king himself as a private devotional. It obviously is hinged, as you can see, and he would have probably taken it with him on campaign so that he could pray privately before important events or even every night. Something that I think Americans are familiar with, I know I certainly am, is what we would call a Pembroke Table, which obviously they would say in England is Pembroke. And that was designed by the famous architect Earl, the ninth Earl, who I mentioned earlier, who designed the Palladian Bridge. This is a relatively small table with two small leaves that drops down, and Pembroke tables are now found all over the world. So another little bit of influence we have from the family. And the last bit of influence from that family I'll leave you with is Pembroke College in Oxford, which was founded and named after the third Earl of Pembroke, and one of the most prestigious colleges in the world. It's just an astonishing coming together of bits and pieces that makes you realize what one family can do to influence the world for good. So if we look at the other films that are done here, there's quite a variety, but the one that I find most intriguing is the next to last one there, Outlander, the TV series, which was filmed here in 2016. And it was filmed here because the movie company didn't want to have to pay, and this gets back to what I said to you earlier about trying to consolidate your filming locations. They didn't want to have to pay to go to France. So Wilton House became Versailles. When the characters go to Versailles, they're actually at Wilton House. And you can just see the huge variety of things that are put together here. And I have to also mention Barry Lyndon at the very top there, the 1975 production. Barry Lyndon is the first major movie I can think of that used an enormous amount of British houses. I mean, it's astonishing if you look how many places Stanley Kubrick used, just mind-blowing. So now we're going to go to London, back to London, I should say, and we're going to go to, depending on how you want to say it, Lancaster House or Lancaster House. This is considered mostly by people today, like me, the greatest surviving townhouse in London. And I have those two red arrows there for a purpose. The arrow on the left is Green Park, to give you a sense of place of where we are. The arrow on the right is Clarence House, where Prince Charles lives today. So this is right in the middle of this incredible row of impressive houses here. This house was built originally in the 19th century for the Duke of York, who was a son of King George III. It passed through a number of families after his death and ended up being finished and fitted out very grandly by the Dukes of Sutherland. It was then called Sutherland House. Before that, it was called York House. And then in the early 20th century, the man who founded Lever Brothers, the great soap company, bought it, gave it to the nation, and named it Lancaster House after his native county of Lancashire. So you walk inside to the entrance hall, sort of a vestibule, and you'll see what that red arrow is. It's nice looking, it's impressive. The door isn't huge, so you're not really prepared as you walk through that door for what you come into in the Great Hall. And that's this spectacular staircase. And there's nothing else like this in London. As a matter of fact, this staircase is much more opulent than anything in Buckingham Palace. I have that stamp. I bought that stamp on eBay just for this lecture because I think it illustrates such a cool point. The stamp commemorates the 1984 economic summit in London between all of the major powers. And it was hosted by Margaret Thatcher, who, of course, was the prime minister, and it was hosted in this house. And that's what this house is used for today. It is owned by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and it's used for conferences and for visiting dignitaries and heads of state. So as a hostess, Margaret Thatcher is marching in the president of France, Francois Mitterrand, and who has never been here before. And she's talking about policy. And he's like, screw that. What is this? If we go to the next slide, you can see the full view of the staircase and why he was doing this, which really irritated Margaret Thatcher because she didn't have much of a sense of art. And being a Frenchman, he was like, geez, Louise, this is incredible. And it's actually interesting because the Sutherlands, the Duke and Duchess of Sutherland, who finished off this house, were the ones who made the staircase as it looks today. And when Queen Victoria, who was a great friend of the Duchess of Sutherland, came here for the very first time, she very famously said, I come from my house to your palace. And then as now, the monarchy does not have a staircase anywhere near as grand as this. And the grandness continues because the rooms beyond this is very Italian looking, the staircase hall. When you go into the staterooms, they're all done in the French style of Louis XV. So look here at the state dining room with the arms of the Dukes of Sutherland over the door. I'm just, once again, the palace doesn't have anything like this. And when we pull back into this next shot, which is the same room, you can see just the amazing grandeur, why this is the single most popular spot for filming interiors at Buckingham Palace. It's so grand. If you look through TV shows and movies, you'll see this over and over again. And in the true French fashion, you have this amazing enfilade of one sequence of rooms opening up into another with these grand doors. This is entirely French, and this was unusual. The English, of course, hating the French for the last 1,000 years, that you would emulate French styles in such a grand scale. And that continues in here to the picture gallery, which, as you might suspect, was put in place just to show off your collection of pictures. And it's still used that way today. I was very lucky to take these photographs in person because this house is not open to the public, as you might imagine. It took me almost a year to get permission to bring a group here, and we had to go through all kinds of security procedures. It was just amazing to walk through these halls. As a matter of fact, this room here, the picture gallery, is the room where Princess Diana in the TV series roller skates in when she first moves into the palace and has nothing better to do. So as you can see here, once again, a wide variety of movies have been filmed here. My favorite, because it's such a horrible movie, is King Ralph, which has John Goodman as an American who inherits the throne after the entire royal family is mistakenly electrocuted. It's just horrible, but it's actually sort of fun to watch. Downton Abbey, this was actually in the 2013 episode when they're presented to the king and queen. And of course, as you can imagine, that was in the same staircase hall that we just saw because it is so impossibly grand. Another house that's impossibly grand, that's in Buckinghamshire and also incredibly French, is Waddesdon Manor that you see here. This was built in the 19th century for Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild. It was built in the style of a 16th century French chateau, and it has 18th century French interiors. It's owned by the National Trust now. It is one, probably the only Rothschild house left in Europe that has all of its original contents. There were at one point 40 great Rothschild houses throughout Europe, and the contents of almost all of them have been dispersed. This is the only one that has everything in it, and it's really because the family was so rich, and because the last owner, James de Rothschild, who gave the house to the National Trust in the 1950s with all of its contents, also provided a large endowment. And I have to say, as a sidebar here, he is somebody who I have particular respect for because he was responsible for forming Kindertransport, which was this program in the 1930s leading up to World War II that saved 10,000 Jewish children from Germany and got them out and brought them to Britain. And a lot of them were housed here during the war. So you go to the inside. I said that it's like 18th century France on the inside. And because the Rothschilds were so over the top, the Rothschilds loved gold and loved bling. And there's actually a phrase called Le goût Rothschild, the taste of the Rothschilds. Everything had to be over the top and big and blingy as possible. And when you go, for instance, into the gray drawing room, which you'll see in this next slide, I love this shot because I took this at night, as you can probably imagine, and the only light is that chandelier and those two Reynolds that have the picture lights on them. And that's the thing, those paintings are a perfect example of how the Rothschilds collected, which is that they had houses that were cluttered, but everything, even the smallest things, were masterpieces. And they had a predilection for things that were French. And to me, sort of a tour de force of that statement of all things French is the dining room. Once again, I was very lucky taking this photograph at night without a flash. And it just is everything that you need to feel of what it was like to walk into the time of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And what's interesting is how these houses, I think, have been reinterpreted over the last 20 or 30 years. In the old days, which in this case would be like the 1980s and before, this room would have presented very bright with lots of halogen lights because you want to see the details of all the amazing art. What you're seeing now, the candles that are in those chandeliers are meant to be mimicking candlelight. and they're actually at the right wattage that recreates candlelight, because what we don't realize now when we throw huge bright light on pieces of art is that most of these interiors and the art were designed specifically to be seen in candlelight. And I think you can capture some of that magic here. The other thing is, the reason this house has such incredible interiors is that when it was being built, Baron Haussmann, who Napoleon III had hired to redesign Paris, which gave us the wide boulevards of Paris that we see today, really the city we see today. In order to accomplish that, huge numbers of buildings were torn down, including 17th and 18th century houses. And the Rothschilds, not just Baron Ferdinand, but a lot of his relatives, bought the interiors of these great 17th and 18th century houses in Paris and then recreated them here. Because this is like what this is. This is all using paneling boiserie that was taken from French houses of the period. Once again, an incredible selection of movies that were done here. I find, to me, Daniel Deronda, and he knew he was right, two wonderful PBS, BBC series from the early 2000s, beautifully done. But once again, Downton Abbey, I don't know if you guys can remember all the way back until 2011, when Lady Mary was going to marry Sir Richard, the evil newspaper baron, and he bought for her a house that showed that he was actually the right man for her. He could take care of her. And this was the house that he bought. The exterior that they showed in the TV series was Waddesdon Manor. Interestingly enough, they didn't just use houses. This is Goldsmiths Hall in London. There has been a Goldsmiths Hall here since the 1330s. Now, think about that. This particular hall was built in the 19th century. And what the Goldsmiths Hall is a livery company. London has over 100 livery companies. And livery companies are sort of, but not quite, unions of professions that come together. And the Goldsmiths Company is important because the only way you could ensure the purity of gold or silver was to take it to the Goldsmiths Hall to be hallmarked. And that is, in fact, where we get the term hallmarked from, because you, as the maker, the goldsmith, you could be cheating your clients. So you would take it to this place, they would certify it, and they issued you your own mark, and there was a year mark and a city mark, and those are all the things we use today to identify these incredibly important pieces of silver and gold. And the real reason for that is just to establish a sense of standards. This space has a room, which you're going to see next, that is grander than anything in Buckingham Palace. It's the room that you can rent for your wedding today. You can see here on this photograph, the copyright is the Worshipful Company of Farmers, another one of the guilds. And they're all called worshipful. And it's not for any particular la-di-da reason. It's just that they all worshipped together. They would all pray together before a meal. And it's actually the Worshipful Company of Farmers who have rented the Goldsmiths Hall for their annual dinner that you see it set up here. And in the fourth season of The Crown, this is where Princess Diana's grandmother began schooling her on the etiquette of becoming a princess. Moor Park is this amazing 17th century house in Hertfordshire. Amazing because it cost, in today's dollars, about $200 million to build. The interior, which you see there on the right, is sort of over the top, very un-English, very Baroque. Painted once again by Sir James Thornhill, who we saw earlier at the Old Royal Naval College, and who also painted the dome of St. Paul's. This is now a private golf club. And like almost anything else, you can also rent it for your wedding. Now we're going to move on to Windsor Castle. Windsor is the largest occupied castle in the world. It is an astonishing sight. This is actually a 19th century engraving. But to portray its interiors, they made some interesting choices, which I think are quite wonderful. The first one I'm going to talk about is a house called Audley End in Essex, which is owned by English Heritage, which is a charity that's very similar to the National Trust. What's interesting about this house is it is actually a fragment of its original size. It was built in the 17th century for the Lord Treasurer to the King, to James I. who was siphoning off money from the government, of course, to build this house. And when the king came to visit him, he very famously said, upon touring the house, "Too large for a king, but might do for a Lord Treasurer." Because it was so huge, it was truncated repeatedly in size and brought down to what you see today. As far as I can tell, they only used one room when they filmed the supposed interiors of Windsor Castle, and it's this one, the Great Hall. This is how you walk into the house today. And of course, because since it is owned by English Heritage, it's open to the public. It's an amazing space, and what's incredible about this house is that, with one exception, which I'm going to show you, the interiors have pretty much remained the same. And to show you how famous the interiors were, this next room, which is called the saloon, this is an illustration from an 1881 photograph that I bought on eBay. This was a page in a book. Someone very sadly ripped this out of the book to sell it, but this was a whole book of the great houses of England from the 19th century. In this room, that amazing plasterwork, that Jacobean plasterwork, is still the same today as it was then. And keeping that same theme, which is sort of like a Jacobean / Gothic feeling. If you go into the chapel, almost unchanged, just lovely vaulting. The one room that has changed, in the 18th century, the family decided that they needed to be updated in the latest style, so they hired the ubiquitous Robert Adam, and he redid an existing room, the little drawing room. And you see it here. It's so out of context with the rest of the house. Me being a neoclassicist, I just think it's just fantastic. It's just luscious. And I have to tell you, I was here with a friend, Eddie, and you're not allowed to take photographs in here. And I said to him, "You got to cover me." And I pulled out my phone and I took this picture with my phone, which I think came out pretty damn well. So this house was the only house that I had trouble finding movies that actually resonate with anybody, because I have to be honest with you, I'd never heard of any of these movies except, of course, the Antiques Roadshow. But I wanted to make sure all the houses had other things you could see filming-wise there. It's an amazing house. It's in a beautiful setting. I really recommend that you visit. It's very close to London as well. It's one of the houses that doesn't get the attention that it deserves. In the second and third seasons, Belvoir Castle was the location for Windsor Castle. And I have to stop here because of the name of this place. Let me say that again. Beaver, like the animal with a big flat tail. It, of course, should be Belvoir because it's taken from the French, meaning beautiful view. And, of course, the English, I think, take particular glee in slaughtering French words that creep into their language. I actually have a pronunciation guide on my website, and this is the star example. Beaver, because there's just no way in the world you can get beaver out of that. But it's an amazing place, an amazing house. It was originally built in the 16th century, and like a lot of these houses, has been added to over the years and changed. What you see here is primarily a 19th century rebuilding in a romantic castle style, which is very popular. And you'll see why it's called Beautiful View when we get to a few other shots, because we're coming up from behind here. This is how you enter the castle today. And on the other side, sort of like down the hill, is you can see this enormous house. And it sits on this incredible mini mountaintop. And as you'll see in the next slide, you get a feeling for how high up it sits. This is an 1880s lithograph from another book. And look down to the very bottom of that. You can see the little people and little sheep down there. It makes you see how this castle almost magically floats in the clouds. It's been owned by the same family since it was built. The family has the title today of the Dukes of Rutland, and they still live there. I think all of you know, am obsessed with English houses, and I can trace the very first time I ever saw an English house to this salad plate. This was one of the pieces of my grandmother's Johnson Brothers Old Britain Castle series, and we had about, I think, 100 pieces of this when I was growing up. This was the good china. We couldn't use it, only for Christmas and Easter. And every plate had a different castle on it, and I fell in love with this one because it's just so romantic. It's just so cool. I actually, when my mother died, we gave most of this away, but I kept this one plate because it's just so so important to who I am and to how I first became interested in these things. So here is the divine Helena Bonham Carter as Princess Margaret standing in front of Belvoir Castle, that side that I showed you earlier that you drive up on. And this is just after the scene where she has come back from her triumph, her visit to Washington, where she bonds with LBJ and tells dirty jokes. And so she goes to the Queen and says, look, I can do good stuff. Give me something to do. And as we all know, the Queen said no. And that's why she's looking so dejected. But a lovely scene nonetheless. This is a sunny day. You, of course, are filming in England, so you can't always get sunny days. So in this next photograph, they're filming inside, but there's no sun, as you can tell. So look what they have on that crane. That is a light that is shining down into that window that's on the second floor, what we would call in America the second floor. And it's, you see, it's interesting how they're doing it. It's not directly into the window. It's coming from above, as sunlight would do. So from the inside, you get the feeling of light. And you can see some of that light here in the King's Room. As I said to you earlier, most of these houses had suites built for a royal visit. This is one of them here. This is a suite of rooms that was done for the King. In this case, it would have been George IV, and this was the room that had his day bed in it. But what they used most particularly in the filming of the TV series are scenes like this. This is the staircase officially called the guard room staircase. And it has, it's everything you expect a castle to be. And there are a lot of scenes with the Queen and her family running around using this, because in fact, there actually are rooms at Windsor that are very much like this. And this, the picture gallery, once again, very much something that you would find in every large country house and certainly at Windsor Castle. And here you see the best pictures that are owned by the Dukes of Rutland. We have Poussin, we have Holbein, Rubens, Reynolds, just an astonishing collection of art. The real reason you come here, if you're a connoisseur of architecture, is to see two particular rooms that were done in the early 19th century by the then Duchess Elizabeth. And the first of those is the Regent's Gallery, which you see here. And those windows look out to that huge view you saw over in the distance. And the Regent in this case was the man who became George IV. His father, of course, George III, was insane. And he was given a regency to act for him, which is why when he visited frequently, it was called the Regent's Gallery. The most famous room is the Elizabeth Saloon, which you see in this next shot, which I think is just way too French for my taste, way too gildy, very unusual for its time period, so over the top French. This is just, this is even before what we saw at Lancaster House. And that's interesting because the woman who's responsible for both the Elizabeth Saloon here and for Lancaster House is this woman, Elizabeth, the 5th Duchess of Rutland. So she was having an affair with the Duke of York, who built what we now call Lancaster House. And amazingly enough, she had this affair with the approval of her husband, who was so enamored with her. He said, "That's lovely, dear. You have an affair with whomever you like." Those of you who travel with me know that I love elderflower cordial, which is something that's very unique to Britain, although I think other countries have attempted recently to copy them. And this is my favorite. I buy this from Amazon. It's Beaver elderflower cordial. And cordial in this case means you buy this syrup-like, and it's made from elderflowers. It's non-alcoholic, and it's quite sweet. And you cut it with just this sparkly water, plain unflavored water, and the more water you've had, the less sweet it is. It is one of the most refreshing drinks in the world. That's a very subjective opinion, of course. Now, this is also used a lot for filming, as you can imagine. My favorite one here is the 2006 movie, The Da Vinci Code, because it stood in for the Pope's summer residence. And this gets back to what I'm trying to say to you about not using different countries if we don't have to. So the movie makers were saying, why should we go to Italy when we can use this house, which has Italian precedence? Now, if we're going to talk about houses that have Italian influences, one of the most amazing in Britain is this house, Burghley House in Lincolnshire. And in the 4th season of The Crown, and in the 5th and 6th, we think, this has become Windsor Castle. So they've stopped using Beaver, and now they're using Burghley. Burghley is still owned by the original family that built it. It's most famous today for horses, because it has one of the most important equestrian events in the world here, the Land Rover Burghley horse trials, which attracts hundreds of thousands of people every year. But of course, I'm interested in the architecture and to show you the immensity of this house. Look at this photograph of the courtyard. This house was built in the 1580s. It's just unlike anything else, I think, ever before in Britain. We think it was designed by the man who built it, the owner. There is no known architect. It has a lot of influences of Italy and other European influences. And this is the man. This is William Cecil. The Cecil family, as I say, still owns it today. He was First Lord Burghley. He was the equivalent of the Prime Minister to Elizabeth I. And he, from his offices, which is a nice way of saying from the money he skimmed off the top of the government, he built this great house. He also created the very first Secret Service and is considered one of the greatest spy masters that Britain has ever had. There is some evidence to suggest that the man known as Shakespeare actually worked for him and was writing down in code in his plays messages as he went around Europe performing things. As oftentimes happens, houses change over the years, and his descendant, the fifth Earl of Exeter, in the 17th century, redid the interiors. Now, this particular Earl was obsessed with everything Italian, and in this case, he spent years at the Medici court and Florence, and ended up creating one of the most important collections of 17th century Italian paintings in the world. We know that he bought over 300 of these paintings while he was living in Florence, and then he hired this amazing Italian, Antonio Verrio, to come back and paint the rooms of his house in the latest style. So this is Verrio, who was in demand all over Europe. This is his only known room that he did from floor to ceiling, and this shows you heaven, which, not surprisingly, is Roman, as it should be. And of course, if you have a heaven room, you have to have a hell room. And in this case, you have the hell staircase, also painted by Verrio. And that staircase itself, which is in a Roman style, we think was copied off one in the Louvre, you can see that even hell is actually quite nice, at least by classical standards. In this close-up photograph, even though people are falling and looking a little hot, look at those incredible columns with those gilded capitals and happy people celebrating there on the left. So basically what I think Verrio is telling us is that hell really isn't that bad as long as it's an Italian hell. So there's a lot of important grille work in this house, and this is actually a photograph that I took of a group I brought here about 6 years ago, looking out from the inside to the grille work on that door. And you see this grille work many times actually in the fourth season of The Crown, and we had such an amazing time here. Right outside of this room, right to the left, we walked in to this small little room that isn't open to the public, and there, as you'll see in this next slide, the wonderful curator John Culverhouse had out for us an incredible expanse of treasures to share with us, including these amazing drawings. But what I want to particularly draw your attention to is that white napkin on the right, which has little things sitting on top of it. These are all jeweled objects, mainly from the 17th century, that he pulled out for us to look at. And the one that I was able to take a photograph of is this perfume bottle. So this is a piece of rock crystal that has been hollowed out, and then it has emeralds and rubies attached to it, and then it has a little rock crystal stopper, and you would have kept this in your pocket to perfume yourself with. And this, of course, is Indian, because it's interesting to realize that until the 18th century, almost all the major jewels in the world came from India. Matter of fact, at that time, diamonds only came from India. So the best, most wonderful pieces of jewels came from here. This house is famous, as I say, for its paintings collection. And you can see here in this almost endless sequence of rooms, this is the blue silk dressing room. Also incredibly important collection of porcelain. As a matter of fact, the earliest piece of porcelain ever made in Europe is in the collection here. So you see this shot. Well, let's look in the next photograph. Same room, just going slightly over to the right, keeping the staircase, sorry, the fireplace to the left. These are all those incredible Italian paintings that I mentioned to you that were acquired in the 17th century. The other thing it has is an incredible survival, which is a Tudor kitchen. This is one of only two that I know of that to survive in its original form. The other is at Hampton Court Palace. And the reason that the kitchens don't survive, the reason, for instance, in Downton Abbey, that the kitchens were done on a soundstage in London as opposed to filming in the real house is because kitchens very seldom survive unaltered because technology continues to change. And of course, everybody wants to update their kitchen. The reason this one survived is because they built a new kitchen closer to the dining room, and this one was just sort of left as it was. You can see the people on the tour, all of them taking pictures because it's such an amazing survival. We ended this tour having tea in one of the private rooms of the family, and this is the current owner's daughter, who was a real pipperoo, as my mother would say. She was wonderful. She was so much fun. Homemade scones. I mean, what could be better than England? I mean, really, why should we live anywhere else? Look at the movies that have been filmed here. My favorite, believe it or not, is Bleak House. This is the 1985 version with the wonderful, late, great Diana Rigg as Lady Honoraria. But so many things. Middlemarch, the Buccaneers, incredible filming location. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Kensington Palace. It's probably the most accessible of all the royal palaces. It sits in the middle of Kensington Park. It doesn't have, as you can see here, a whole lot of fencing. It's open to the public, parts of it. It also has royal apartments in it. So this is where Princess Margaret had her apartments. This is where Kate and William had apartments. So when you recreate this, the key thing here is lots of red brick. And one of the primary filming locations for that was Brocket Hall in Hertfordshire. I find these shots I took interesting because you can see a difference in these than all the other photographs I'm going to show you. These were taken with something called film about 25 years ago, as opposed to digital photography, which of course I use now. And you can just see there's I can't explain it. There's a lack of crispness. There is a yellowish to them because they've been. I scanned the original photographs for this lecture, and I still couldn't make them any better than this. This is a wonderful 18th century house designed by James Payn, one of the great English architects. It's famous for two particular rooms, for the saloon, which you see here, which is famous for its incredible painted ceiling. And I was very lucky. I had been invited to a lunch here, and you can see this room had just been set for lunch. We haven't quite eaten it yet. This is used all the time, this particular room, for ballroom scenes in English period dramas, from Pride and Prejudice to Sense and Sensibility. It's just the right size for a film company. It's bright enough, and it works great for ballrooms. You can actually film people dancing. This is, I think, the most important space here. This is the staircase. It is unlike any other staircase I have ever seen in an English country house. Once you see it, you never quite forget it. Very Italian in its influence, particularly, I would say, from the designs of Raphael, but just wonderful. This house has had money troubles, so it is now a private golf club. And you'll see here in this next slide very clearly it's a golf club that has been in the foreground playing golf. But I want to draw your attention to the placement of the house. This is something that was very important as early as the 17th century, but certainly by the 18th century when this house was built. That rise in the land would have been picked as a perfect spot. There was a river here, but it wasn't running in front of the house like this. So they diverted the river just so it would run in front of the house. And then they purposely diverted it so they could build a bridge, and Payn designed the bridge as well, just at this spot. So you're meant to be coming down the path. And Ginevra, if you can move your cursor, thank you very much. That's the path the carriage would come down. We used to come down that today. And that eventually leads over to the bridge and then goes up to the house. But you're meant to stop right when you get here. You're meant to gasp and go, whoa, look at that. A waterfall, a bridge, and a house behind it. Almost all of these houses were perfectly sited for that reason, to give a great sense of anticipation. Once again, another popular house for filming. The one that I'm going to mention here is Belgravia, that came out last year, the TV series that I think a lot of us watched, that was beautifully done, but so many wonderful things. And it's also important to remember, as we saw with the old Royal Naval College, that every house that's used for filming isn't actually a house. And in that case, I'm talking about Wellington College in Berkshire, which you see here. This is a college in the English sense, which means that it's a prep school. It's a 19th century building. And if you remember in the fourth season of The Crown, Princess Margaret is oftentimes coming, and is Princess Diana, into this courtyard at Kensington Palace. So that was right here. And this actually has appeared in a number of episodes of Midsummer Murders as well. It's very dramatic. This architecture meant to be based on the work of Wren, Christopher Wren, the great 17th century architect, could only be Victorian. No one else built with this exuberance except the Victorians. Now, the most diverse house in the whole series is this house, Rudham Park. This is also on my pronunciation guide, because why would you say Rudham? But that is in fact how it's pronounced. This is in Hertfordshire, and it is the largest house in the home counties. The home counties are a circle of counties that surrounds London, that is still privately owned and is owned by its original family. Built in the 18th century, incredibly grand. Most famous, I think, to most people from its starring role as Gosford Park in the movie of the same name. This is never open to the public, used more than any house I'm aware of for filming. And they used it a lot here. So the exterior you see up there on the top, that was used as Gatcombe Park, Princess Anne's country house. The interiors were used for Gatcombe Park. The image on the bottom right there, that was used for Princess Margaret's interior at Kensington Palace. I don't have a photograph of it here, but the room in Buckingham Palace, where the Queen always has her weekly audiences with the Prime Minister, that was in Rudham. The staircase was used for a variety of royal residences. It's an amazing location, and it's so rich, and it has most of its original collections in it. Balmoral is unique in that it is the only house that is only used for one house, which is to say the filmmakers only use one filming location instead of multiple. The real one, of course, which you see here, was designed in the mid-19th century, probably designed by Prince Albert, but certainly he and Queen Victoria made this their favorite home. And this architecture, which is called Scottish baronial, does not exist anywhere else in the world. It is unique to Scotland. And you can see, if you look here, this is the filming location that they use. This is a private house called Ardbericky in the Highlands. And just like the real one, Balmoral, very much in the 19th century Scottish baronial style. The inside, also used for the interiors of Balmoral in the Crown. The only thing this could be is Victorian, that over-the-top interior. Those of you who have really sharp eyes will recognize this in its most famous starring role, which was in the TV series Monarch of the Glen. It also, not surprisingly, was used as Balmoral Castle in the 1997 movie Mrs. Brown, and it's going to appear this year in the latest James Bond movie, No Time to Die. So I have to at least give a nod to Wales, because Wales is an incredibly important place and doesn't get anywhere near enough attention. If you remember in the fourth season, Prince Charles has his installation as Prince of Wales at Carnarvon Castle, which you see here. This is an incredibly important castle built in the 12th century by King Edward I of England, a very important, dangerous man. He was known as the Hammer of the Scots. He was pretty ruthless. He subjugated Wales, and to remind them that they were a country with an English foot on top of them, he built these enormous castles all over Wales to contain the Welsh population. He created his son, later Edward II, the very first English Prince of Wales, obviously a title that has continued down to this day. And if you'll remember the scene of the investiture of the real Prince of Wales in 1969, you can see actually a photograph of the real thing happening here. And the movie makers copied this down to a T. They did an amazing job. The thing to remember here, I think people make the mistake of assuming that the eldest son of the monarch is automatically the Prince of Wales. It is a title that is bestowed upon the monarch. It's not something that's automatic. It can be given at any time in someone's life. The thing that I think is coolest about what's going on here is that coronet on his head. And it's important to mention that only a king and a queen can have a crown. Everybody else who has that thing that looks like a crown on top of their head is a coronet. And this coronet was unusual because it was made specifically for the investiture of the prince. It has all kinds of cool stuff going on. It very much reflects the 1960s in its design. So you see there in section 1, where I have that number there, those are two important symbols. That is, on the far left, the 3 feathers of the Prince of Wales, and then there is a Christian crown to the right. These are studded, the whole crown is actually studded with diamonds and emeralds, and that's because the national colors of Wales are white and green. So those two things, the fleur-de-lis, the feathers, and the crown, are made from solid gold. And it's Welsh gold. They're actually Welsh gold mines. That's nice. Number 2, which is the body of the coronet, that's actually plastic that has been plated with gold, which I think is so cool. But the best part of all is the orb with the cross on top, which symbolizes Christ's sovereignty over the world. That must be the world. That's actually a gilded ping pong ball, because it was cheap, which is nice, but every single time I've heard anybody who's worn a crown being interviewed about wearing the crown, they all say the same thing. They're so heavy, they give you a headache. So one of the things that was very much in the uppermost reaches of the mind of the designer of this was to make it as light as possible. And what could be lighter than using a ping pong ball? So I mentioned that none of this was filmed in the United States. So when you saw Princess Margaret go to the White House, this is the house that was used, this 18th century house called Highlands in Essex, owned by the local government and open to the public. It did not have those 2 wings that you see there. They were taken off with CGI. And to the left where those trees are, they put in the Treasury Department. This has been used for the White House before, because for obvious reasons. But it shows you, I think, a perfect way to end on an American note. And those of you who know me know that we always have to end with a picture of my cat. And this is Miles in his wintry mode, looking at a piece of Simon Pierce that was given to him as a Christmas gift a few years ago. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end. Thank you so very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Curt, for that fantastic and entertaining presentation. So before we get to everyone's questions, I'm excited to announce several upcoming art and architecture programs. Next week, in fact, we will be holding our first ever virtual DiCamillo rendezvous, bringing together longtime tour participants and viewers of this webinar series for a special event featuring Curt, as well as historian Carl Raymond. They will be discussing New York and London in the Gilded Age, and registration is open and available. And then starting next month in February, I'm happy to announce that registration is open for our 3-part course, An Explosion of Beauty, the Art, Architecture, and Collections of British Country Houses, led by our very own Curt DiCamillo. And this seminar will span roughly 2.5 centuries worth of British decorative arts and style, discussing Palladian, Rococo, chinoiserie, neoclassical, medieval revival, and more. And to learn more and register for those and all of our other programs, you can go to americanancestors.org/education/online-classes. All right, so let's get to your questions. If you have anything that you'd like to ask, go ahead and type them into the question panel, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time provided. So Patricia asks, can you please comment on the rugs in some of the rooms and interiors that we saw?
I wish I could comment, Patricia, but I don't know enough about rugs to offer any commentary. I will say that oftentimes in the 17th and 18th centuries, the most expensive things in these houses were the rugs and the tapestries, more valuable than the paintings, more valuable than even the jewels. And rugs generally came, as you would imagine, from Turkey. They are also made in France, and later on they were made in England. But beyond that, I'm sorry, I just don't know enough about rugs to be able to give you an appropriate answer.
All right, they certainly are fantastic and just gorgeous. So maybe we need to look more into that. Pam asks, Curt, what is your favorite good choice location for a crown scene?
Good choice. Well, I'm going to get back to what I said earlier about Princess Alice, Prince Philip's mother. Just thinking about it now just almost makes me tear up, of Prince Philip coming to see her in her sort of garret bedroom in Buckingham Palace, which was actually, as I said, in Osterley Park. And she's praying when he walks up, and she's done, she's kneeling, and she looks up and she sees him. And there's just been this amazing article that's been written about her in one of the London papers saying what a good person she is. That to me is one of the simplest but most poignant moments in the whole TV series, and that would be my one takeaway.
Now Mark asks, how are the artworks? I would also imagine some of the furniture and other pieces within these collections. How are they protected during filming?
That's a really good question, and it depends on the venue. It also depends on what the filmmakers want. Generally, the owner of the house controls all of this. So, for instance, they will say to the film company, you can't touch anything in here, you can't use any, or we're taking all the furniture out, you have to bring your own furniture in. There's, as you can imagine, there are prop houses that do nothing but supply period appropriate furniture that are copies of real furniture. What I see mostly in these grand houses is that the walls are left as they really are, which is the real pictures hanging on the walls, and the furniture is removed. And once again, I don't know if that's the choice of the film company because they have a certain look they want, which may not include the furniture that's there, or if it's quite rightly, I would say, the owner of the house saying, you're not having my furniture made by Chippendale with 22 prop men and lighting men and cameramen running around. Because I've heard horror stories from house owners about this, about leaving the original furniture in. And you get a lot of guys who just don't know what it is, and they sit on it, they drink on it, and poof. Of course, all of these things are written in the contracts that any damage has to be paid for by the film company. But if you're the owner of the piece of art, it doesn't make you feel any better, especially if it's irreplaceable. So in most cases, you see things moved out. There are some cases where the entire house has been repainted on the inside because the movie company doesn't like the color of the walls. And in those cases, the contracts almost always require that everything be returned to the way it was before. Very expensive. This is one of the reasons why, this is the single biggest reason why The Crown is the most expensive TV series ever made.
Now we have several questions asking about other properties that were used for The Crown, if we have a list of all of the locations either that we've mentioned today or that were used in the filming of The Crown. And I know that you have a very special and personal resource that we can share with folks. So do you want to talk about that?
I will, you had an earlier version, Ginevra. I'll send you out, this is a Word document, and you can use it as a PDF or whatever you want. So I'm looking at it now, and I'll send this to Ginevra, and she can send it on to everybody. So it's 40 places, I mentioned to you before. That's in the first page. The second page, I have grouped down a breakdown by place. So I've got just Buckingham Palace, Kensington Palace, Windsor. For instance, I have South Africa, because South Africa stood in as Kenya, as Australia, as the Amazon, as Bermuda, as Tonga. I love this. Westminster Abbey, obviously you can't film in Westminster Abbey. All the scenes that were filmed supposedly in Westminster Abbey were done in Ely Cathedral, which is in Cambridgeshire. So that's what's on this list, and you will all have it very soon.
Great. And of course, I don't know if you want to talk about your the DiCamillo.com, the website that you run, and how you have filming locations listed there as well.
I do. There is, if you go to my website, there are 3 main sections. The one you want to go to is called Houses. And then when you get to that page, you want to look on the left for a bar that says Advanced Search. And you open that up, and there is a box in there that will enable you to type in the name of any movie or television show. And if I have figured out where it is, if you type it in and press find, it will return to you every house where that TV show or movie was filmed.
No, Barry has a really interesting question. I mean, did the producers, did they seem to show any concern for the similarity between the rooms they chose and the actual rooms themselves? I mean, were they trying to go for accuracy, or what do you think?
Well, I think they were, because if you look, and I can use Kensington Palace as a good example. I mentioned to you that that Brocket Hall and Wellington College, the two locations that I showed you for Kensington, are both red brick, and of course Kensington is primarily red brick. So I would say yes. When it comes to grand interiors, with the exception of Windsor Castle, which they tried to keep castle-y looking, the other ones, were just grand. They didn't have it. You can't copy Buckingham Palace interiors, so they were just, obviously the location scouts were just looking for big, blingy rooms. And there's something else that would have helped them enormously in their search. There is an association called the Historic Houses Association in England, which is sort of a lobbying group representing private house owners, and you can join as a friend. So I'm a friend of the HHA, and that gives you free entry to about 100 houses that are privately owned throughout England. One of the things that the HHA offers its members, the owners of these houses, is a film service. So you sign up, you send the HHA pictures of the interior, exterior house, and then the HHA has a movie liaison officer, whose only job is to go to the movie companies. Movie companies come to him or her, and they say, I'm looking for this. And he says, hold on, let me type into my database. Oh, this house, and that house had those kinds of interiors. But once again, getting back to Barry's question, I think the most important thing for the interiors was just big, impressive stuff. Because most people, particularly Americans and the Chinese, which are the two biggest markets for this, we all go on the wow factor. We want really big, blingy stuff. And they delivered.
And a similar question, I mean, Henrietta asks about, or mentions, in the room that's always used for the Queen's audiences with the prime ministers, there's, very obviously placed a few canalettos on easels in that room. Do you know if that's
Yes.
kind of an accurate representation of what might exist in Buckingham Palace, or is that kind of conjecture or something else? Does that kind of go to the bling factor?
I would say that's a combination of all of those things, actually, because the Royal Collection, of which the Queen is the head, has a huge collection of canalettos. That room, as I mentioned to you, is in Rudham, the house in Hertfordshire. And I think, I don't know, because I've never been to Rudham, because you can't get in. But from what I know, that room is primarily set up as it exists, meaning the people, the Byng family, BYNG, who live there. I think that room's pretty much the way it is with them living in it. I suspect things like that canaletto, which of course is a copy, I would think, were brought in specifically to add a little extra bling. So that's what I mean when I say it's probably a combination of both.
All right. I know we're over time. Maybe just a few more questions. A few people are asking about, of course, you mentioned all the filming locations being, well, not all of them, but most of them being in the UK. Do you know if any properties in Ireland were used for The Crown?
Nope, they were not. And this is terrible to say. I mean, what I would say to you from a practical standpoint is, why would you go to Ireland when you're in England? Not that it's anything against Ireland, it's that Irish architecture is very much in the same design as English architecture, and that's primarily because Ireland was basically an English colony for hundreds of years. But the point is money and logistics. So because the houses in Ireland are so much the same as England, you were filming in England, there's no reason to go to Ireland. There's nothing different there you can't get in England, and you don't want to have to go to more locations than you absolutely have to.
And a few people have also asked about, are any of the actual royal properties and estates allowed to be used for filming?
Allowed to? I don't think it's like it's against the law. I'm not aware of any of them that has ever been used for filming. There are some examples, for instance, of exteriors of Windsor, taken from what's called Windsor Great Park, which is the great park that surrounds it, where they'll allow filming in the park with distant views of the castle. I'm not aware of any ever examples of anything on the inside except for documentaries, like for instance, where the Queen's talking to you about the Royal Collection or something like that. But for filming, I don't think they ever allow it. And that, of course, is exactly why you see all these houses being used for the filming, because you can't get into the real things to film.
And finally, I did not plant this question. I feel like this question comes up every time, and I swear I am not planting these questions. Robin says this was fabulous and is now ready to book a trip with us. So are there plans for future architecture tours?
Well, yes, there are plans. There are always plans. The reality, of course, is we don't know if we can implement those plans. The two that I feel really strong, meaning I think we'll have the health behind us to be able to make these happen, are at the end of this year, as you might imagine. The first one is in October, where we're doing Villas and Gardens of Rome. And I think it's really important, if you love British architecture, to understand that so much of it comes from Rome and from Italy. And the Italians have always been an obsession with the Brits. Unfortunately, they love the culture. The most famous thing, which I've heard as recently as 20 years ago from an English friend of mine, is like, oh, Italy is so wonderful. Such a shame it's filled with Italians. But still, so much of what we know about British design starts from there. So I think that's an important sort of seminal part. And then in December, we're doing an English country Christmas at my favorite place to stay in the entire world, which is Weston Park in Shropshire, where we will have this entire 17th century country house to ourselves with 2 butlers and a French chef and 1,000 acres of Cape Lily Brown parkland. Now, that said, we are still hoping, fingers and toes crossed, that we will be able to do a trip we have scheduled for June to country houses of Norfolk. Norfolk has some of the most important country houses in England, specifically 2 that come to mind, Houghton Hall and Hokum Hall, who have interiors that just knock your socks off. So if we're really lucky, that will be our first one in June.
All right. Well, thank you, Curt. We do hope that those can move forward. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. If we didn't get to your question, or you'd like to learn more about some of the heritage tours and other art and architecture programs that we're offering, you can write to heritagetours@nehgs.org. I will also be sending you a follow-up email with links to the recording and some other information, some of the other resources that we've mentioned, including that list of the filming locations. I'll include that both on our website as well as I'll include it on the website and a link in the YouTube video when we post it there. So you should be able to find it pretty easily. So thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and for others to enjoy. If you'd like to learn more about American Ancestors and those heritage tours that we just mentioned, many of which are led by Curt, please visit americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.